So respiratory system today. Respiratory refers basically to respiration, or another word for it, breathing. Now, during respiration, you take in oxygen and you eliminate carbon dioxide. This is the final product. Now, if you're a very, very primitive organism, single cell, all what you need, for example, if you're a bacteria, all what you need is to take in oxygen from, and imagine that you're in water. This is in a lake or anywhere where there is water. You take in the oxygen that is dissolved in the water and you use it, the bacteria uses and eliminates the carbon dioxide through this process called diffusion or simple diffusion, simple diffusion. Now, as you get more advanced, you start developing different types of respiratory organs, as we call them. Now, here you can see a flatworm, which is pretty simple. This is the one that goes through simple diffusion because it's in some type of water. Then as you move to terrestrial, let's still actually stay in the water first. Fish, for example, fish use these units or this system, which are called gills. Now, gills are pretty interesting. Let me see, I thought I had a picture here. But gills, what they have, if this is the fish, from the heart, carbon dioxide comes, or blood comes to the gills right here. Carbon dioxide comes to the gills, and while it comes to the gills right here, what is going to happen? Water flushes this way, these gills. This is called counter current flow, or it looks something like this, to put it. If this is the blood vessel and carbon dioxide comes in this direction, as water flushes the gills, water has oxygen, good waters. Now, oxygen is going to keep flushing this blood vessel here. Oxygen goes in the blood vessel, carbon dioxide comes out. Now, by the time the blood gets here or leaves the gills, it's full of oxygen. Then the blood goes to the body, and then it comes back in here and brings more carbon dioxide. So this is called counter current flow. So one more time, blood vessels, the veins basically, come from the heart and they bring carbon dioxide. Now, the advantage of gills, because gills are the most efficient respiratory machine, the most efficient out of everything. Why? Because in water, you have very little oxygen. In water, you have about 1% oxygen in water. So it's very, very little. So fish has to extract all that oxygen. So how are they going to do it? When the blood vessels pass through or the veins pass through, they are washed by the water this way. Water, it's filled up with oxygen. So then through diffusion, oxygen moves inside the capillaries in the gills. So blood gets oxygenated. So as they leave the gills, blood is full of oxygen. Now this is called counter current flow because it works kind of like this. As the blood moves in one direction, picks up oxygen in the opposite. So you constantly bring fresh supply of oxygen. If you notice right here, it constantly brings basically fresh supply of oxygen as the blood moves along the veins in the gills. Now, oh, right here, you could see it. So as you see right here, water keeps washing here. So right in here, that's where basically oxygen keeps penetrating it, or oxygen keeps moving in. This is called counter current flow. You can see here the analogy. Water moves that way, blood moves this way. As it constantly moves this way, it picks up fresh oxygen. This is called counter current. So it basically goes against the current. Now here you have the land organisms. The most primitive ones are basically the insects and the other arthropods. Now these ones developed this little structure which are called trachea. This is the trachea, which takes the blood to the hearts right here. Oxygen goes in. There is an air sac right here. This air sacs right here through this entrance, which is called the spiracle. The entrance is called spiracle. Then it moves up the trachea in the sac, and then it's pumped into the trachea. Then it reaches the heart. So basically, arthropods get their oxygen through this little branch structure, which are called trachea, with the help of air sac and through the opening, which is called the spiracle. Now, this trachea will branch into this smaller other structure, which are called tracheoles. And these tracheoles come in direct contact basically with the cells that make up the organism or the arthropod itself. You can see right here a figure of it. You can see the air sacs in, pumped through trachea to the heart, and then this trachea has a bunch of these little tracheoles. You can see them right here. This is a good picture actually right here. You could see the trachea, you could see the tracheole, and it takes them directly to the air sac, to the body cells, to the cells. Now, as you go to more advanced land organisms, now they develop the structure that we have also, which are called lungs. Now, lungs, which is interesting, it's believed that it evolved from the pharyngeal region. From the pharyngeal region, from the pharynx, that's what it's believed that actually lungs evolved, or lower pharyngeal region, the region right there. Now, the next most advanced land organisms are the amphibians. Amphibians, water, live in water, plus land. So they spend their time a lot of times in water, but they have to spend time in land also. That's why it's called an amphibian. Now, when you look at an amphibian, you could see their lungs are still pretty primitive. They are not really finely divided right here. When you look at the reptile and when you look at the humans, they are really, really fully developed. They are much more developed, not fully developed for reptiles. But you see this, there's not too many blood vessels through it. So it's basically not as developed as the reptiles and the humans, or mammals in general. So amphibians get about 10% of their oxygen from water. So one more time, the amphibian lungs are very primitive. They are not fully developed. They are not very vascularized as the mammals, not even close to the reptiles either. Why? Because they spend part of their life in water, where they absorb 10% of the oxygen through the skin. Now, reptiles are completely adapted to land. They could go in the water, but they do not absorb oxygen from water through the skin. Now, reptiles also have scales on their skin, or the skin is made up of scales, basically to reduce perspiration or loss of water. Now, the lining of the lungs, the inner lining, it's way more finely divided, and it has more vascularization. You can see right here, they have some of this vascularization, and it's much more efficient than the amphibian lungs. Birds are the next one. Now, lung of birds are a little bit different. Why? Because birds spend most of their time in air flying. So birds are using a very interesting way of breathing. So let me put right here bird. Let me put right here bird at the bottom. So birds are not, they don't really show right here. Oops. Let me go back. Oops. So let me go right here, birds. So let me write birds. So for birds, basically, let's assume that this is the beak right here. Let's assume that's the beak. So they get their oxygen. Now oxygen goes through one pipe and it comes as carbon dioxide through another route. So oxygen, oxygen, here you would have the lungs. This region right here would be the lungs, or the air sacs, they are called. And then carbon dioxide comes through a different pipe. Everything that we talked so far basically uses the same route. Oxygen goes in through the trachea for humans or mammals or reptiles, and it gets to the lungs, and carbon dioxide comes exactly through the same pipe. So basically there is a mixture of oxygen and carbon dioxide. When we talk about birds, birds do not mix, do not mix oxygen and carbon dioxide. For mammals, amphibian and reptiles, oxygen and carbon dioxide will mix in the lungs. Imagine us, when we breathe in, we take in oxygen, it goes through the trachea, through the nostrils, then the trachea to the lungs. When the oxygen ends up in the lungs, carbon dioxide, it's already built up in the lungs. And when we breathe out carbon dioxide. Now, do you think that you breathe out only carbon dioxide? Of course not. We breathe some of the oxygen also. So there is a mix that we breathe out. When we breathe in, you breathe in air or oxygen, but when we breathe out some of that oxygen. For birds, actually, there is no oxygen that is breathed out because oxygen goes through a different route to the lungs. And let me show you actually. Let's go right here and let's see. Let me see birds' lungs so I can show you how they look like. Birds' lungs. So when you see right here, let me share with you guys. Right there. So these are the bird's lungs. So air will go through this trachea, goes to the lungs. Then you have a bunch of these sacs which will store the oxygen right here. Then these are the lungs that they use. They are connected to the sacs, use the oxygen, and then the carbon dioxide comes through a different route outside. So there is basically no mix of oxygen and carbon dioxide. You can see right here. Goes through, you can see how nice actually the air sacs. You see how they go? Carbon dioxide, air sacs empty, oxygen goes in. Oh, I like this picture actually. It's moving. So you can see right here as air sacs go in, as oxygen goes in, these air sacs right here fill up. Then they are used by the lungs. Then check out how carbon dioxide takes a different route to come out. So basically there is no mix of oxygen with carbon dioxide. Oxygen takes this route right here, gets to the lungs, then carbon dioxide is going to build up here, and then boom, it's going to come out. All right. Now let's see what happens with the mammals, since we are the mammals. Now, for mammals, when you look right here, the lungs looks very finely divided. These are very advanced and very good basically at absorbing some of that oxygen that we take in. Now remember, birds are the most advanced lungs, use the most advanced lungs. Why? Because they do not have a mix of carbon dioxide and oxygen taking place. But overall, fish have advanced lungs for terrestrial animals, for birds, terrestrial, or above the water. Now fish, you have the most out of all of them, most advanced technology, advanced lungs because there is very little oxygen in water. So these are the most advanced out of all of the lungs, the fish, the gills. For fish, most advanced, let's not call them lungs because that's completely wrong if I say lungs, but let me wipe that thing. Where's that? Let me wipe this thing right there. The lungs are not there basically. Okay, I cannot delete them, but basically right here, forget about lungs, let's call them gills because they are not really lungs. So they are like lungs. Now, when you look at humans, look how finely divided. Look at these structures that we have right here. We have to basically take in, or the way we are able to take in the oxygen. They are really finely divided and they have this structure which are called alveoli. So I'm going to go in a minute over all of them. Now about human respiratory system. How is it organized? Upper part, lower part. Upper part, it's made up of nasal or the nose. Then as it moves down, you have the pharynx. And then right here, there is a confluence. One that goes down digestive system, one that goes through this route. It's called the respiratory system. Now, that's where respiratory system, that's where respiratory system stops, the upper respiratory system, and lower respiratory system starts. So the upper part is made up of the nose with the nasal cavities, followed by the pharynx, and then right here, the confluence, you have the larynx. Now, as you move down, you'll have the lower respiratory tract, trachea, you have the bronchi, then you have the bronchioles, which are these little branches. And then at the end of the bronchioles, there is the actual alveoli. Now remember, right below the lungs, it's a muscle, which is called the diaphragm. Now, if you stand up and you try to breathe in, you can feel actually that muscle. When it's contracting, when you take air in, and it's relaxing when you breathe out. And we're going to talk about that one in just a few minutes. So upper respiratory tract made up of nostril, the nose with the nostril, then the nasal cavities. Right in this region right here, we have a few, let me see, I don't see them here, but right there you have the sinuses. You can see some of the sinuses that we have. Then you have the pharynx region and then the larynx. Now, these are part of the upper respiratory tract. What is the function of the nose? Nose has three important functions. Basically, in the nose, we have hair, which will clean up the air. Also, as the air moves down the nostril, it starts being warmed up and it also humidified. Why does it have to be humidified and warmed up? Because when it reaches the lungs, the air has to be fully warmed and fully humidified. Now, when you go usually in the winter, in the cold mornings, you go out and you start running, you're gonna notice that your lungs or the chest region actually kind of like hurts or it's sore a little bit. Why? Because you get a lot of that cold air. It takes a while for the lungs to warm up the air. So that's why you get that feeling. But usually if you breathe normal, you get as the air moves down from outside to the lungs, it gets actually warmed up. So here you can see that. Then, you can see what it happens right here. This is not the right picture here because this is how food it's ingested. So what I'm trying to show you here is basically air comes through here. Now, while it gets here, we have this little region which is called the epiglottis. Now, epiglottis closes when food passes through, and this epiglottis stays open when there is no food coming down. So when we swallow, we can breathe and swallow at the same time. So basically, air, it's filtered, warmed up, and humidified while it's moving down. Now in this region right here, we have the larynx. What is larynx? Larynx, it's also known as the voice box. Larynx, it's a muscle. That's why When you get a sore throat, you get an inflammation of the larynx, and that's why we can't speak properly, because of that inflammation. So your larynx, it's not a bone or cartilage, it's actually a muscle. Now, we were right this region right here so far. Remember, this is the epiglottis there, which is that cartilage bone that goes up and down, and it closes only when we eat, when we swallow. No, when we eat and we swallow. But what it happens basically, what it happens here, this epiglottis has to close. If it doesn't close, it's a problem. If it doesn't close, it's a problem, because then you will choke. So one more time, fast. Upper respiratory tract made up of nasal cavity. As air moves there through the nose, you have hair which will filter it and will actually also humidify, and also it will purify the air. All right, the lower respiratory tract, it's made up of trachea, followed by the bronchi, then the little structures here, which are called the bronchioles, and then if you look here, you could see this other structure, which are called the alveoli. Alveoli are just like sacs-like structure, which basically they will dilate. By dilating, what they do, basically, they expand, they increase the surface area. Why do you need that increase in surface area? You need that increase in surface area so you can absorb more of the oxygen. So there's going to be enough blood vessels, as you see right here, that have enough time to absorb the oxygen, so enough time to eliminate the carbon dioxide as the oxygen passes, as the blood passes by the lungs or through the lungs. So one more time, the lower part made up of the trachea, followed by the bronchi, then the smaller structures here, which are the bronchioles, these branches right here. And then right at the end of these branches here, you have these air sacs, which are called alveoli. Alveoli's function is to actually allow the transfer of oxygen and carbon dioxide. As you see right here, as blood vessels pass, or as oxygen pass through the blood vessels surrounding the sacs or the alveoli, carbon dioxide moves out, oxygen moves in. Here you have another picture. This is how an alveoli look like. It's an enlarged sac right here. Carbon dioxide moves out, oxygen moves in to the blood vessel. This alveoli is part of the sac or part of the lungs. Here, if you notice, carbon dioxide and oxygen kind of like mix, as I told you guys earlier. Now, how do we breathe? As I mentioned earlier, we use this muscle, which is called the diaphragm. Now, what happens when let's assume that this is trachea. These are the lungs right here. These are the lungs right here. Now, as you breathe in, you bring in oxygen. How did that oxygen goes in? Right at the bottom here, there's this muscle, which is called the diaphragm. Now, kind of like touch right below your ribs. Touch that area when you breathe in. And you notice that actually, when you breathe in, this muscle will contract. So when you breathe in, diaphragm contracts. And the rib cage area that's made up of all these bones that are here, it will rise. While they're gonna rise, basically, while they're going to rise, it will allow the lungs to expand. So we reduce basically the pressure inside the lungs, and the pressure from outside is going to push inside. You create basically negative pressure inside the lungs, which will allow for the oxygen to move in. So check out right here. When you breathe in, basically the pressure outside, it's higher than the pressure. So let's say pressure outside pressure inside, P inside. So for breathing in or for inspiration, P outside, it's higher than P pressure inside. How is that possible? Because what it happens, rib cage rises, and the diaphragm lowers. By lowering, the diaphragm basically gets it's contracted, and then it will lower. This rib cage will rise. The pressure inside the lungs, it's lower than outside, so air will move in. As you breathe out, this diaphragm relaxes. If you notice right here, relaxes. By relaxing, it's gonna push up against the sacs right here, against the lungs. Then the rib cage will push against the lungs too, will lower. Now the pressure inside, it's higher than the pressure outside. So air will move outside. So that's how we basically eliminate the carbon dioxide through the process called expiration. So inside you create negative pressure. So that's why air moves in. Then we create here positive pressure inside the lungs. Now we take about between, I put here 14 to 20, but it's actually between 10 and 20 breaths per minute. Now, the more in shape you are, the less breath you need to take. The more fat you are, or the less in shape you are, or you don't exercise, the more breath you need to take. On average, we take about 450 liters of carbon dioxide. We exhale actually about 450 liters of carbon dioxide per day. Now, through a typical breath, through a normal breath, we take about 0.5 liter to 1 liter, depending. Females take less than the male. Male take about 1 liter. Female, when they take in, they take about half of that. Now, this type of breathing is called tidal volume. The amount of air that we take in through a normal breath, it's called tidal volume. Vital capacity, it's the maximum amount that we can, this is the keyword, force. So it's basically one of those breaths that you take in and you breathe forcefully inside. You try to take as much air as you can inside. Now, male have about vital capacity about 4.5, female have a little bit less, between 3 to 3.5 liters. Residual volume, it's the air that it's left in the lungs. This is left after a maximal expiration, maximal breathing out. So when you breathe out completely, you force yourself to breathe out and you breathe out all the way, that's whatever it's left, it's called actually residual volume. You don't breathe out all the air from your lungs through a normal breath, or even when you try to force everything out, you cannot get rid of it. Now, who carries the oxygen, or how is that oxygen that was breathed in the lungs and absorbed in the blood is going to be used? That oxygen that was absorbed right here at the sacs, at the alveoli, what it's going to do, it's basically going to be bound to this molecule, which is called hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin, it's made up of 4 subunits, these blue ones, 1, 2, 3, 4 subunits, which have inside these hemigroups. Now, these hemigroups basically are made up of iron. They are made up of iron. Now, if you notice, this iron binds oxygen. That's where the oxygen is bound. So when you look right here, how many molecules of oxygen bind to hemoglobin? For each of this hemigroup, you get 2 oxygen molecules. So since there is 1, 2, 3, 4, it's going to be 8 total oxygen molecules bind to the hemoglobin. So remember, there is This whole structure right here, it's called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin, it's made up of 4 subunits. These are proteins, basically. Now, in each of these subunits, you have these hemigroups, which basically contain iron, and oxygen binds to the iron, not to the actual protein itself. It binds to the hemigroup, or the iron there. Now, what happens once the oxygen gets to the cells? Let me go right here. Here would be the cells. Here it's the blood vessels. Now, the blood vessels, they go to the cells are called arteries. Now, once they get to the arteries push it to arterioles. We learned this one last week, and eventually gets to capillaries. That's the only place where actually nutrients and oxygen are capable of moving outside the circulatory system. So here is the cell. The cell performs its function, especially mainly cellular respiration. During cellular respiration, remember, they use oxygen and turns into carbon dioxide. That's what it happens during cell respiration. So as the blood gets here, this cell now, since it's using up all this oxygen, it produces a lot of carbon dioxide. So the cell, it's high concentration of carbon dioxide. When the blood passes by the cells from arteries, it's filled up with oxygen. Since there is very little oxygen inside, there is high concentration outside in the capillaries, and there is less concentration inside the cell, oxygen will move in. Carbon dioxide, being in high concentration inside the cell, will move outside into the capillaries. So carbon dioxide is going to move this way, oxygen is going to move in. Now remember, oxygen travels bound to the hemoglobin or attached to the hemigroups. Now, this protein hemoglobin, while it passes through here, it will start changing its structure, its conformation. It will start to get partially denatured. Denature means that it changes its structures. How is that possible? Because this carbon dioxide, as soon as it's transferred to the blood, reacts with, or it starts mixing with water and turns into this highly acidic bicarbonate ion. This bicarbonate ion, as I mentioned a minute ago, it's highly acidic, or it's acidic. Now, acidity denatures the protein. In our case, since this carbonic acid or bicarbonate ion, it's slightly acidic, what it's going to do, it's going to partially denature the hemoglobin. Oh, you can see it right here. Water plus carbon dioxide turns into carbonic acid. Now, what's going to happen? Basically, this hemoglobin gets partially denatured, so it's not able or capable of picking up the carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide gets to dissolve in water, react with water, and turns into carbonic acid. So remember, oxygen traveled attached to hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide, it's dissolved in plasma or the water. This one increases acidity. Now, this blood from the cells travels back to the heart, where it's going to be pumped to the lungs. Now, breathing rate depends on the amount of carbon dioxide dissolved in the blood. So the amount of carbon dioxide dissolved in the blood, it's going to lead to increased or decreased breathing rate. Increased or decreased breathing rate, depending how much carbon dioxide. So it's not the amount of oxygen that makes us have less amount of breath per minute, but it's rather the actual amount of carbon dioxide dissolved in the blood. Now, how is that possible? Because blood passes by this region, cerebrospinal fluid region. The pH of the cerebrospinal fluid, it's maintained constant. It's maintained constant. And if the blood has, for example, a pH of 6.8, once it passes by the cerebrospinal fluid, the brain detects that, oops, there's a difference in pH. So now I have too much carbon dioxide. So what do? I need to eliminate the carbon dioxide. So then I will increase my breath, the number of breaths that I take. And this one, when I have a really acidic pH for the blood, this is called hypercarbia. Hyper means a lot. Carbia refers to carbon dioxide. So I have hypercarbia. Now, if I hyperventilate, which is the opposite, I breathe in a lot of oxygen. By breathing in a lot of oxygen and eliminating a lot of carbon dioxide, the pH of the blood actually becomes slightly basic, 7.5. Once it passes by the cerebrospinal fluid, CBSF, cerebrospinal fluid, what it happens, it detects, which is a 7.3, it detects that it's basic. So now it tells the lungs to decrease the breathing rate. By decreasing the breathing rate, we bring it back to the equilibrium or to the homeostasis. So remember, when you hold your breath, you increase the amount of carbon dioxide and you reduce the pH. pH becomes way more acidic. When you hyperventilate, you actually take in more oxygen and you eliminate a lot of carbon dioxide. By eliminating a lot of this carbon dioxide, your blood becomes slightly basic. By becoming slightly basic, it's going to tell the lungs to stop or to reduce the breathing rate. When you have a decreased amount of oxygen in the tissue, which is part of hypercarbia, basically this is called hypoxia. Hypoxia. So sometimes even if the blood flows normally, for some reason the cells do not pick up all the oxygen, then it leads to hypoxia. So you have this whole explanation right in here. So when the blood passes through the blood vessels surrounding the alveoli, the carbon dioxide diffuses into the alveoli for expiration. pH of blood becomes now what? If you eliminate a lot of the carbon dioxide, pH becomes slightly basic because you lose a lot of that carbon dioxide. Now, this leads to an increase in ventilation. Homeostasis is basically equilibrium, when all the function in the body have to be kept at equilibrium. Now let's talk a little bit about acclimatization. What is that? Basically, it's the process of adjusting while we go to high altitudes. Why is acclimatization important? Because as you go to high altitudes, the amount of oxygen, it's the same. Oxygen, it's the same as when you are at the sea level. The difference is pressure. Pressure at high altitudes, it's lower. So when we talked about right here, when we talked about pressure right here, the pressure outside versus pressure inside during breathing, if the pressure is lower outside, we take in less oxygen. So if you take in less oxygen, that's when you provide less oxygen to the tissue. So when you go to high levels, basically it takes a few days to acclimatize, where the body will learn that it needs to increase the breathing rate so you can take in the same amount of oxygen. So basically the human body needs to adjust to the atmospheric pressure. Here, you guys have a couple of questions about respiration. As I mentioned earlier, CO2 levels control the respiratory rate. By increasing the carbon dioxide in the blood, it causes an increase in respiratory rate. Decreasing the carbon dioxide in the blood, it's a decrease in respiratory rate. And if you have any questions, ask me. I think we do this week. This week, yes, we're doing the respiratory rates in the lab. Hyperventilation causes a decrease in blood CO2 levels, and holding your breath increases the carbon dioxide level. Now, body requires oxygen for metabolism, but remember, low oxygen levels do not stimulate breathing. What it stimulates breathing, it's basically the levels of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is the one that it's involved in increasing or decreasing the breathing rate. Breathing low pressure air or gas mixture basically leads to unconsciousness. So it's when you go to high altitudes, if you don't, or if you go above 8,000 meters, you don't have, there's not enough pressure. The pressure drops to about 200 torrs. At 200 torrs, your body doesn't get enough oxygen, and that's what it leads to unconsciousness. So that's when you go try to climb Mount Everest, you have to acclimatize every, I think, a 5,000 meter, and then each 1,000 meter, you have to acclimatize. You have to stay for like 2 to 3 days to acclimatize. At 8,000 meter, you are not able to acclimatize anymore. Above 8,000 meter, actually, you have to take tanks of oxygen if you want to climb all the way to the top. Now let's talk a little bit about the actual diseases or effects or diseases of the respiratory system. The first one, it's the effects of aging. What happens with the respiratory system while we age? First, we lose elasticity. By losing elasticity, it leads to arthritic changes. What is that? By losing elasticity, we don't get enough oxygen. You start getting your bones hurting. Now you don't get enough oxygen. Also, an effect of aging, it's emphysema. Basically, what happens when you expose the lungs throughout the lifetime to all kinds of irritants like cigarettes, like other chemicals, then basically what's going to happen, this alveoli right here, I thought I have it right, yes, right here, this alveoli starts breaking, and now rather than having sacs-like structure right here, you just have just a big sac right there, which will not be able to get enough oxygen. Now, people with emphysema, when the alveoli basically burst, they do not get enough oxygen. So that's why you see them, they get tired very quick, and a lot of times they walk around with tanks of oxygen. That's the effects of aging. Now, other respiratory issues, upper respiratory tract infection could be strep, sinusitis, tonsillitis, laryngitis. Laryngitis, infection of the larynx, which is a muscle, so leads to the loss of voice. Infection of the tonsil, it's basically tonsillitis. Sinusitis, infection of the sinuses. We have those sinuses next to the nasal region. And strep, it's an infection of in the throat with the Streptococcus pyogenes, which is the bacteria that produces that. What I'm showing you right here, these are lower respiratory tract infections. Pneumonia. Pneumonia, it's basically when alveoli fill with pus and fluid, and then because of bacteria, and then it's very difficult to breathe. Asthma, it's basically an inflammation of the bronchioles or bronchi right here, the inflammation. So basically by inflaming, you don't get enough oxygen. So that's why we cough. Bronchitis, an inflammation, acute or chronic of the bronchi, which will lead also to not enough oxygen. One more infection with bacteria, it's tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, basically, it's bacteria that encapsulates in the alveoli, and basically it will not allow the alveoli to expand. So that's what it happens. And this bacteria also start destroying the wall of the alveoli, and that's why those alveoli bleed. And that's why people with tuberculosis, when they cough, they bleed or they cough blood out. Fibrosis or pulmonary fibrosis, it's when we take all kinds of irritants inside the lungs, or we breathe in like asbestos, which are really fine particles. They attach to the sacs right there, to the alveoli. And once they attach to the alveoli, they reduce elasticity. And if they reduce elasticity, there's not enough oxygen to be, they don't expand enough. So then there's not enough oxygen to be taken in. Other lower respiratory tract infection, lung cancer, which is basically a thickening or callousing of the cell line of the airways. You can see here asthma. This is a normal. This is a person that has asthma with the inflammation of the bronchi. And also, we talked about the tuberculosis, pneumonia, bronchitis, and emphysema. You have all of them right here. And this is basically, let me see.